Welcome back to the Third Party Cup Podcast. I'm Jason.
I'm TC.
Let me take a minute to address something. My name is Jason, and my nickname is Tuck. So if you're watching any of our shorts and you hear me say Tuck, that's my nickname. Call me Tuck, call me Jason, call me whatever you want. I'm good. How you feeling?
As long as we get the message through.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm
a little sad.
Sad?
Brian Wilson died.
Oh, no.
Sail on, sailor.
Sail on, sailor.
As promised last week, this one's Jason's.
Well, it kind of has to be because you stimulated my brain. Last week we talked about freedom as a philosophy, as a concept. And we talked about the framers of the Constitution evolving out of monarchy. And they were back and forth on this idea of freedom and what it meant. And for me, it stimulated the question, the idea of freedom stimulated the question, the freedom from what, or the freedom to what, was kind of where my head with it. We went with it. We talked about Krishnamurti, and even in as late as the 1980s, still trying to grapple with this concept of freedom as a philosophy, that, you know, it's more of a feeling than it is something you can actually put your finger on. And, you know, we talked about the framers. Fortunately, they wrote down most everything they felt about what they were thinking about the concept of freedom and how it should fit into this new way of thinking, you know, from the idea that now there's no royal blood. We're breaking the back of that. Now there's this new way of thinking about who we are as people. And they wrote a bunch of it down. And we discussed their constitutional format offers rights and liberties to the people, but it limits authorities of the representation or of government. And after all of that conversation, I really didn't know the tack you were going to take. I mean, we kind of discussed it, but I didn't have like a full rundown. And I'm really glad that you took that tack, because that was a great place to start. And it sent me to the books, of course, to try and find quotes. And then that sent me to the best place to know what things mean, which is the dictionary. And so I looked up, and this is... which dictionary is this?
The American Heritage.
It's the American Heritage Dictionary. And the definitions, there's 3 definitions for both freedom and the word liberty. And I looked freedom up first, and the definition was the condition of not being in prison or captivity. That was the main number 1 definition. The condition of not being imprisoned or in captivity. That's a pretty basic definition, I think,
pretty
of freedom.
Straightforward.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. The second one was the condition of being able to act without control or interference by another or by a circumstance. That, too, is pretty straightforward. The third one was the condition of not being controlled by another nation, i.e. political independence. All 3 of these definitions are very boiled down, I would say, like they're least common denominators. So then I looked up the word liberty.
Because that is a word that the Founding Fathers used often.
Indeed, particularly with respect to the idea of a liberal democracy. And, you know, last week we said a lot of times we use words interchangeably when they're not really interchangeable. These words are different. They're nuanced. And liberty means something a little bit different. So liberty says the condition of being free from confinement, servitude, or forced labor, which I thought was a little more nuanced. That, you know, giving specific things that you are free from. The second definition was the condition of being free from oppressive restrictions or control by a government or other power. Restrictions or oppressions. The third one was the right to engage in certain actions without control or interference by a government or other power. So you have the right to engage in certain actions. I would assume certain actions would mean actions agreed upon.
Like the First Amendment.
Like the First Amendment. So in these definitions of freedom and liberty, we kind of start to get a clear blueprint for what the framers saw as government of the people and the rule of law, which essentially could be boiled down into two things: freedom from the whims of a man, because monarchy, they had liberties that were offered them by the monarch and were subject to the monarch. So depending on
the monarch's mood,
how he felt that day, you know, maybe you had liberties, maybe you didn't. They wanted freedom from the whims of a man, and they wanted freedom to just about anything we can agree upon. And if you look in the Constitution, you'll see that to be true. And I love this quote. Then I went to the quotes. Thomas Paine is probably my favorite of all the quoters. And Thomas Paine says, liberty is the power to do everything that does not interfere with the rights of others. Thus, the exercise of the natural rights of everyday individuals has no limits, save those that assure the other members of society the enjoyment of the same rights. That, to me, suggests that the framers had every intention for us to be allowed to be just as free as we could possibly agree upon. And if you think about it, that's pretty free. We talked about it last week. You're free in this country to go buy a gun and shoot people. Now, it doesn't mean there's not consequences, but nobody's going to stop you from doing it. You can't do that in other countries, can you? I mean, you can't do it in Mexico.
Can't buy a firearm in the first place.
Yeah, I was like, essentially, we have a lot of freedom in this country. Now, there are some arguments that maybe we shouldn't be that free. Maybe that's a little too liberal. And there's people on the other side that's saying we're not free enough. But it's clear that the framers of our Constitution meant for us to be free. George Washington said, "The establishment of civil and religious liberties was the motive which induced me to the field. The object is attained, and it remains my earnest wish and prayer that the citizens of the U.S. could make a wise and virtuous use of the blessings placed before them." Benjamin Franklin said, "God grant that not only the love of liberty, but a thorough knowledge of the rights of man may pervade all the nations of the earth, so that a philosopher may set foot anywhere on its surface and say, 'This is my country.'" So it's pretty clear that they didn't just mean for freedom to be here, but that it should pervade throughout the world. We talked last week about Belgium has freedom. 187 sovereign countries have freedom. Why? Why do those countries have freedom? We discussed last week about how before this country, The world was mostly ruled by monarchy, and it was this country that broke the back of the idea of royal blood. 200 years later, all of these countries have some version of freedom. Maybe they're not quite as free as us in some ways, but they have some version. It looks like they set us on a...
And it was because of the American example.
Lincoln said, freedom is the last best hope for Earth. Not the U.S. Earth. It's clear that the plan was to spread freedom. Benjamin Franklin said, it's better that 100 criminals escape than one innocent should suffer. And this concept shows throughout our judicial system. I mean, if you look at the advantage that the presumed innocent has in our court system. I mean, you have to start with a grand jury, and that's usually like 30 people or something. Mm-hmm. And the grand jury has to come together and hear the broad evidence and determine whether or not they should even move forward. Then there's an arraignment. Then you can hear evidence, and hey, you can petition to have evidence thrown out. You get to pick in the jury process. You can have witnesses thrown out for certain reasons. You can appeal. There is a massive advantage in how our legal system is set up that advantages the presumed innocent. And I think that brings us to the concept of habeas corpus, which we're going to talk about next week. The literal translation of habeas corpus is, you should have the body. John Adams said, but a constitution of government once changed from freedom can never be restored. Liberty once lost is lost forever. Next week, we're going to do our best to answer the question, who should have the body? If you made it this far, please like, please share, please subscribe, please do all of these things. Please tell your friends. Please join the conversation.
Join the conversation. We would love to hear from you.
And comment. We can make a difference. All right. We'll see you next week.